So do you ever use pastes in your creative projects? You may see pastes like this and not be sure how to use them, or you may have some sitting on a shelf that you're not too sure how to use, how to tint, how to make them work in your projects. So today I want to share with you how to tint any sort of white paste, whether that is the Tim Holtz texture paste. Superior has their own pastes as well. There's also the more professional grade pastes from Holbein, Liquitex, Golden that come in a variety of different textures and mediums. And today I want to show you how you can tint these pastes and use them in your creative projects. If you haven't met yet, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So let's get started. So let's talk about the differences between these pastes. Basically, they all start with a similar acrylic base, but then what is mixed into them to give them the look and feel that they have changes. So for example, fiber paste has actual paper fibers mixed into the paste, which makes it great for using for watercolor projects, for just using through a stencil, for a lot of different purposes. I like the flexible modeling paste because a flexible modeling paste is meant to work in an art journal because it can stretch quite a bit, which means it won't crack when you're using it on those art journal pages. I also like light molding paste. Light molding paste I like to use a lot in my boards and canvas work. Part of it is because the light molding paste is designed to be used on panels and heavier surfaces without having too much weight. Because regular molding paste has marble dust in it, and you actually lift it up, it has some heft to it because of that marble dust. What the light molding paste does, it also has these little acrylic spheres in the paste. It's very small, you don't actually see them, but they are there and that helps lighten up the paste. So I'll be using light molding paste in today's project and for today's demo, but I want to let you know that if you see fiber paste, anything with a paste behind it can often have color mixed into it the same way. So let's talk about how we can have our paste last a little bit longer. One thing you can do is use Glad Press and Seal. This basically will be added onto the top of my container, and I find it makes the lids easy to get off. That way if you have anything around the lid, you don't have to worry about not being able to pull the medium out of the container or getting the lid off. It makes getting the lid off more easily, and because I live in a very dry climate, by adding that layer of extra sealant onto the top of my jar, it prevents my mediums from drying out nearly as quickly. So I'm just going to grab a tool here. We're just going to grab a big glob of the medium. And what I'll do is I'll take a big glob and then I'll put some other smaller globs. I don't know if glob is the right word, but we're running with glob today. It works for me. Because I want to mix multiple colors for my little palette painting that I'm going to be doing. And that's enough for now. We will probably continue to add more paste. We're going to need more than this for my project, but this is a good place to start. So the first one I'm going to do is going to be using a titanium white paint. And so you might be wondering, why would you use titanium white when you already have a white medium? These pastes are white, but they're not necessarily completely opaque white. If you've used paste for a while, you'll see that they sometimes will go a little bit lighter, they'll go semi-transparent. So I mix in a little bit of the white paint just to make sure that I'm getting a really opaque finish to that white, because I really want it to stick out on this painting and just be a really nice color. And if you feel like you have too much on there, just use another palette knife, get it to stay a little bit more in a group. So this way your colors don't mix together quite as much, at least not at the beginning until you want them to. And any extra paste you have, the easiest way to clean it up is just wipe it off on a piece of paper towel. So let's do another glob of paint. So the paints that I'm using, I have a bunch of these high flow fluid acrylics. I also have some fluid acrylics, nickel azo yellow. You can also use your Amsterdam paints, your Pabio paints. I would suggest anything that has pigment in it is a good choice. So I'd stay away from craft paint. It's gonna need a lot of paint to be able to get the color that you're looking for. And so for this one, I'm just going to add 2 drops of color. The high flow paint has the most pigment in it, so you need very little paint to get really rich colors. And because you are working with a paste, it's going to take a little bit more color to get it to change color. But this is also where maybe I like that really light blue, but maybe I want to take a little section off to the side. So now I can just basically go in, you can add in 1 more drop of paint, and now I have a much deeper color. And so this is where you can get a lot of variation in your colors just by controlling how much paint you're going to add to that surface. I like using the more professional acrylics for this type of mixing, just because I end up needing a lot less paint to get the same effect. Because if you're using a high pigment paint, you don't need a lot of color to get the look that you're looking for. At the same time, use what you have. You can use diary inkers for this, you can use whatever paint you have, but again, I would go with the highest level of pigment that you can get, because it's going to make a big difference in just how much paint you need to use. And you don't want to be losing all of this beautiful volume that you're getting from the mediums, because half the reason you have the mediums is so that you can mix in just a little bit of paint. Good quality paints are more expensive than mediums. So by only needing to use a few drops of the good paint, that's a nice way of being able to really tint your paste a really dark color with only just a few drops of color. If you're interested in seeing a demo about all of the different golden products, I would suggest following Samantha Williams-Chapelski. I was actually taking a free demo with her on the weekend where she was explaining some of the new textures that golden has and some of the ways I can use these textures. So for me, it was a really great way of being able to gain a little bit more knowledge about some of my paints. And these little ones here, these are actually samples that they provide for free, that if you want to get some paint and you live in North America, they will actually send you out samples after the demo if you've been through one of their demos. So it's something to think about. I'm just going to put Samantha's information below. She doesn't pay me to endorse her or anything. I just think she's one of the most amazing artists, and she's an amazing Canadian artist that I have taken classes from, and her work is amazing, and she's just so helpful and so knowledgeable. So if you want to learn a little bit more about golden products and you don't want to spend the money up front, check out one of her demos. That way you can get some free products to try and see what you like. So basically I mixed my 4 colors. The colors I used were the Nickel Azo Yellow. I also used some Quinacridone Magenta. I used some Titanium White. And I used some Indigo. This color Golden doesn't make anymore, but I know they have a phthalo blue that also works very similarly to this and will work really well when you're trying to mix your colors. So in my previous videos, I've showed you how to use paste with the stencil, but this one I want to take a little bit further. So I'm just going to start by just adding in some color onto my surface. And you might be wondering why I made it red. Some of that is, let's say you have little spots in here that you missed a spot. So those red areas are really nice. So if you end up missing an area or you want to scrape something down, you see that lovely red color underneath instead of something that maybe looks like you'd be making more of a mistake. So I just kind of want to add in like a little bit of color to this, and you can see that you can mix the colors together. And that gives a different feel to this. You want this on fairly thick. I'm starting with a thinner layer. I'm going to build up layers as I go, but just this gives you a sense of maybe where we're going with this. Maybe I want to go lighter. So I've just taken some white paste and I've just added in to the side here. And that gives it even a lighter color. So you can see that just by adding in paste, by adding in color, you get a lot of different variations of color. I can also go in and mix some of these colors together. For this case right now, I'm just using mostly just the blue, just to try to get a surface down. And I would usually sketch out some sort of image, but for now, I'm just kind of leaving it as is, playing around with just adding in a layer of color, adding in some textures, adding in some shapes. You can make more swirly shapes. The thicker the paste, the more you can play with this. And what's nice about palette painting is it's a really great way if you have a tendency of overthinking your paintings. You basically have about, and I find I have about an hour. I also live in a much drier climate, but I usually find about an hour, hour and a half, depending on how thick my medium is, to play with this. So you pretty much need to look at your painting, make some decisions, and run with it. And if you choose not to run with it, it's going to dry. The nice thing is when this is dry, you can add also more paint on top. There's no reason you can't. It's just something to think about when you are doing this. There's no leaving it and coming back and fussing some more, leaving it coming back and fussing some more. And that's part of the reason I love palette painting, because I can get so fussy, especially when I'm not trying to. I'm just like, oh, but that has to be perfect and that has to be perfect. So in a sense, this forces a really quick practice. It reminds me of some of the painting exercises I've done with another teacher who would give me 20 minutes. She's like, you got 20 minutes to do your painting. I'm like, oh, it's not enough time. But what's nice about it is it does get you out of that perfectionism mentality. It just forces you to get the color down really quickly. And this is also where I could actually go in with a larger tool like this, or you can go in for a much larger palette knife. Actually, I think I might want to use this one next. So every palette knife is going to give you different texture. I'm using a fair amount of blue, so I'm just going to glop out more of that light modeling paste. Okay. And so... Okay, so I just got the indigo all over my room. I shook it with the lid open and I ended up with paint on the walls, paint on my white furniture, paint on the carpet. So I've spent the last half hour or so cleaning up the mess. But thankfully my paste, because I have a decent amount of paste, is still wet. It's still not fully dry on my surface. So we're going to continue on from there. Oh, I try so hard to be tidy when I do art, but then every once in a while I just have my moment of like lacking awareness and then things just go sideways. So, you know what? It happens to the best of us. So check out my YouTube community. I shared the pictures there so that you can kind of see what happens when things go sideways. So one thing I've learned, grab your carpet cleaner. I have a little handheld carpet cleaner that I had for my pets that I pulled out, and I got most of the blue paint out of the carpet. Hand sanitizer got most of the paint off of the furniture and off the wall, but some it did leave staining. The hard thing with a lot of these indigo and these really deep colors is they do leave a lot of staining. So just be careful and be aware. I eventually... need to remove the carpet out of this room so this doesn't happen again, and it's just the way it goes sometimes. So we have some of our yellow here. I'm gonna take a little bit of this blue and we're gonna mix it together so that we kind of get this like more muted green color. And so this is kind of nice about having the different groups of colors. Now you can sit down and figure out how you want to mix them. So I hadn't quite decided what I wanted to do for a landscape, but I think I'm just going to maybe do some rolling hills. Keep it really simple. This is a place where you can keep to more simple shapes and have a more abstraction in your work and not have it be a problem just because of the way you can put down the medium. I'm enjoying working at this larger brush. It gives a different mark than it does with the smaller ones, and for just getting that first layer of color down, I'm really liking how it looks and just the feel I get from it. And so you can set by adding in your layers of color, and just by even just mixing in small groups of them one at a time, you can get a really different look to this. So I'm just going to add in just that foreground. And maybe this is a heavier application than probably what you would do, but I wanted to show you what you can do with mark making. So for example, I'm just adding in some carved areas. I can leave that a little bit lighter there. You can even have some of that red showing up if that's what you want to do. It's meant to be very light and flowy. And so this is where I'm going to go in with this smaller brush and just start playing around with some mark making. You could actually even do some like stronger lines down if you wanted to try to smooth it on out. You can make it extremely uneven. You can also grab just a little bit of color here, so you go with the indigo. I was telling my husband, like, this color's dead to me. It's made such a mess of my room. I still love this color. It's too bad that golden is no longer making it, but it works really well for landscapes. And so that's a bit much for the color. So we're just going to mix it in and see what I can do just to add maybe little highlights of color throughout my painting. I'll probably refine that a bit more, but that's just kind of a nice shape just to start off with. So by working with a slightly thicker layer of paint, this gives you some really interesting options for color and design. In this case, I'm just going to pull in a little bit of this white. So I want to have that the top is maybe a bit darker, the bottom closer to the horizons a little bit lighter. So I'm just going to bring in, with my smaller palette knife, some different shapes. And this is where you can kind of play back and forth with the medium to figure out how much medium and color you want to add and just basically how you want this to look. Yeah, and so some of that first layer from before I made the mess of my room has dried. But that's okay. That's okay. We'll just continue to add color on it. You're just going to have to add a little bit more medium on it. It's not going to give you as much flow, but it was just kind of a base layer anyway, so I was planning on building things up. So I'm not overly worried about kind of where this has gone. And you can see that those little red spots, they might shine through a little bit, but you can either leave them shining through, you can cover them up. But what I like about this technique is at least then you have a choice of whether or not you let some of that fun color. I find that sometimes when I'm just working on white, it feels like, oh, well, you missed a spot on the canvas. Where with the red, it's almost like, oh, well, that's a really interesting color mix that you've done there. So I really like that feel when you're playing around with color like that. And so now I'm going to start playing around by adding in a few clouds. So we're only really using 3 colors plus white for this one. I really like where we can go with color by creating color harmony by adding these colors together. So not all areas of a cloud are going to be that same white color. I'm trying to look at it as being there's areas of shadow. There are areas that are going to be brighter. The sun's going to hit it in a different place in certain ways. And there's lots of ways you can do clouds. I'm not very practiced with clouds, and that's part of the reason I chose clouds today, just to play around and see kind of what I can come up with for shape. And I'm going to play around with maybe this guy here. This one's a round one. I'm hoping I can maybe create some different style of shapes by playing around with that to kind of give that fluffy look to the cloud. So this one being a little bit flatter, again, gives you a different shape and a different texture, which is fun. Yeah, the bottom of those clouds are a little bit darker. Let's maybe add some color contrast to that sky, because right now it's a lot of the same blue. So I'm just going to come in with a little bit more of the darker color. Looks like it's still mixing on the surface. It's hardening up. It doesn't move. Instead, you get these kind of pulled looking areas, which isn't ideal. But again, sometimes when you get paint all over your room, sometimes you need to stop and clean it up. So, you know, this is the thing, is we learn something new with everything we do, every mistake we make. And it's good, right? Learning that sometimes you need to move in a different direction. Because usually this is where I would be mixing it with the other colors, and instead it's almost going on as another layer of color. So I may just need to build this up again and just add in more layers of color. We're definitely getting some different color mixes, and you can see just how versatile we can get with some of this paste. Again, this isn't meant to be like a crazy complex painting. I am trying to not go totally crazy with too much color, but let's keep playing around. Let's see what else we can get. Just wondering if I want to keep the sky blue, if I want to try to add in some of this pink color. Because again, it doesn't have to always be perfectly photorealistic. Add in some color to that sky. I like that. That's fun. I almost feel like that just adds in a little something to that sky, adds in a little bit more interest. You can see that these colors that I've used, they work really well together. And so sometimes this is the thing, is sometimes instead of getting a zillion colors of paint, and especially if you want to get the good stuff and it's a little bit out of your price range, because even for me, I use mostly student grade paint, and then occasionally for things like this, I use the good stuff. But what's nice is when you already know that, like, oh, I can do a bunch of different color mixes with just these 3 colors. That is a way that you can help extend the life of your paint, because you don't have to buy every color. You can buy just a few colors, play around with it, and see what happens. Ooh, I already had some color there. So we're just going to make that into a cloud then. That's my solution. That's my solution when things kind of go sideways or I make a mistake or I'm not paying too much attention. I think I'm just tired today. I find that, like, I'm usually pretty good about not spilling paint all over my room, but today is one of those days. I think I'm just a little bit tired and things kind of get away from me sometimes. So it's a good start layer of paint, but this needs more. It needs a lot more. It needs more highlights. It needs more color. It needs more play to it. So we're just going to add in another chunk to get that white color going on. And now that I've pulled the white, I realize how stiff some of my medium's getting. And that's the other thing that kind of comes with leaving your medium out too long, is then it starts getting stiff. It's a little harder to work with. So you can see that that red mixed in. Now we end up with areas that have almost a purple cloud. And this is where sometimes I use reference photos for clouds. Sometimes I just kind of wing it, but it does help when you have reference photos. I know for myself, it just makes a big difference. But I think when you're also working with palette painting, you need to try to abstract things as much as you can. You're not going to be able to do super detailed, fine work with a palette knife, at least the ones that I'm using today. I think there are people out there that have the style and the control to go a lot more simplistic with this. For me, I am not that practiced yet. So this is something that I like to work on, but I'm not necessarily great with it yet. But what I wanted to show you is just, again, the options, the possibility, where we could go with this. That could be really, really fun and just really dynamic and just do something different in our creative projects. And if you've never tried palette painting, it's super fun. If I was going to do this in my art journal, I would use flexible modeling paste just so that I don't end up cracking it off. For Golden, it's the modeling paste. For brands like Liquitex, they call it the flexible modeling paste. And that one works really well for things like journals because it won't crack even if it's put on fairly thickly. because this one's a little bit further away, it should be a little bit darker. It's a little closer up, should be lighter. I feel like that's not quite dark enough still. So I'm gonna try mixing a couple of these colors together, or out a dark mix I can get. There we go. So that's creating shadows, because often when you have clouds, you end up getting shadows on the ground, right, from the clouds. So that's kind of what I'm running with there. I'm not sure if it's working or not, but you know what? This is what practice is all about. This is definitely a technique that I don't do a ton of palette painting, and I really should do more, because one, I love it, and two, it's just so rewarding, and it just helps you from getting too precious about your materials, and I find just takes you a really great place in your art. Like I'm a huge fan of it. I feel like that gives at least a sense of depth in it. But maybe I'll come in and do a few, the yellow and this green, and try to get in a few like kind of grassy areas. Sometimes it takes a little bit of fussing with. Again, I didn't really have a great reference photo that I was working off of, or something specific that I wanted to do with this. So I am playing around with this a bit more than I normally would. You can see this playing around with your palette knife. You can get some pretty cool effects going. And this is where, again, you can take a little bit of the white and you can mix it with a little bit of the yellow, and you can keep playing around with this until you come up with the colors that you like. And I put in the yellow, and I'm not sure if I want to leave that much yellow in. I feel like it's just not quite working with where I want this to go. So I'm going to come back in and continue to play with this a little bit. So you can see a lot of this is just play. Play with your palette knife, play with things, come with a bunch of different color mixes. And the key with using mediums is it does save you a lot of money in paint. You might go, well, mediums are expensive, but good quality paint's actually more expensive. So by only having to use a few drops every time you're adding in a new color, that can go a long way for just saving you a lot of money in paint. Because if I did this in paint, I would be going through tubes and tubes of paint, and that would not be very good for my budget. Okay, so I'm just gonna add in some of these. I don't mind a little bit of that like whitey greeny color coming through. I just don't want it to be as predominant as it has been. And this is where you can even come in with a brush. And if you want certain swirly marks in there, because I feel like I'm losing some of the definition. This isn't great for your brushes, so definitely be careful when you're doing this and use a brush you do not love nearly as much, because otherwise you may be very, very sad if it gets wrecked. Okay, you can add back in those shadows underneath those clouds. So it's important when we do this that we look back every once in a while and just take a look at the overall picture before adding in too much more detail. So I think it's a pretty good painting. What I like to do with any bits that I have left over, I always put all the stuff through a stencil. I never put it down the drain. I would also look at using palette paper. When you do this, you really do not want the stuff going down the drain in your house. And I like to either use palette paper so I can just basically throw it in the trash after, or I clean off what I can, throw it through a stencil. It works for another page. And that's just a really great way of being able to use every little bit of this medium. So now I've let this painting dry overnight. And now when we look at it, you might notice that it looks good. I like it, but I find that it has too many of the mid values. So I recently picked up this fun little tool. This is a grayscale and value finder. And what this is useful for is making sure that you have not only white and black, but all these mid values in your paintings. And so what I see is I have a lot of the mid values. I don't have a lot of white, white, or black, black. So to improve on this, I'm going to add in a little bit of color with a paintbrush. Honestly, even though it has been 24 hours, this is not fully cured. I can just feel it. It feels just a little bit moist, so I know it's not fully dry, but it's dry enough and cured enough that I'm able to add color on top. So we need to take a look at our painting and go, well, what do we want to change? And this is the step that I often find the hardest in painting, because I'm pretty good at getting the initial layers down, but then trying to mix and try to find that really nice balance for adding in those highlights and lowlights and those shade areas. I do find it really, really hard. So I'm just gonna go in and do my best and just try to add some highlights and shadows where I can. And when I'm doing this, I'm going to look at some of my shapes. And I don't really like how this hill is. I find that this hill, to me, is very kind of caricature-y. It's a little too, I guess, lumpy and bumpy. And so I'm just going to bring in a little bit of paint here just to make it feel like it's maybe a bit more part of the background, and you'll notice that's going to be not a super even surface to paint off of, and that's part of the reason I'm still sticking with the fluid acrylics. It's going to help with that. And this is maybe where I want to pull in some darker colors. So I have a little bit of Payne's Gray here, where I'm usually trying to stick with the colors that I have, but I want to try to make this even deeper. So by adding in a little bit of Payne's Gray, we're getting closer to that more blackish color that we're looking for. I think that improves that a little bit. Just adds in that little bit of that deeper tone that we're kind of missing there. And I'm going to add it into some of these bushes here. And this is also where I could go in and try to make them a bit more bush shaped. And so that looks to me like a little bit more like a set of bushes there. And maybe on some of these areas I want to have it a little bit more opaque. So this is where I can go in and just add in a little bit of that yellow with a little bit of that white, and that just gives it a little bit of a different look. I would usually do this type of work on an easel, because that way I can usually take a step back, take a look, come back and work on it, take a step back and take another look. But I'm working with what I can here just so that you can see what I'm trying to do while I'm adjusting these colors. Trying to add in some darker and some lighter areas. These could be from the clouds. They can be from just different things that are in the foreground. This one, green, I find a hard one to work with, and it's something that I'm hoping to work on this year as I've been trying to figure out how to do, I guess, better landscape paintings, because a lot of landscapes have green. So how much green do we add? How do we add in a way that looks a little bit more interesting and just adds a dynamic range to our pieces? And sometimes you'll notice when you have the white touch the blue, because it's still wet, it's going to bleed. And honestly, in this case, I kind of want it to bleed, because whenever it bleeds, it turns into some more interesting shades and gives it a little bit more of that softer, more abstract look that we're looking for. So also there's some micaceous iron oxide in here. We'll see how this works. This might be a bridge too far, but we're going to give it a try. It's kind of a black-gray color, and it has some really interesting mica bits in it. So that can be another way you can just add in some very interesting bits to your art pieces. I feel like I do want to definitely keep those darker spots underneath those clouds. Otherwise, it feels like this to me is working a little bit better. I feel like we have a little bit more contrast going on. And sometimes you find like you've done a little bit too much. You can always just wash it down a little bit, because I don't want to lose a lot of that background color. And I do want it to catch some of the high points, but I also want it to move around a little bit. I'm trying to make this a bit more dramatic than what I have right now. Losing some of those values wasn't great. I was going to go in, I'm going to get really good values in this, and then I find that I just end up still painting in some of those mid-tones all the time. So it takes me a little bit of messing around just to see what I can do to try to bring back some of those brighter tones. So a lot of times I use Payne's Gray in place of black. Sometimes I find the black's a little harsh. And I sometimes want to still bring in some of those blue tones that give this painting kind of that fun feel. So that's where sometimes I will come in and use some Payne's Gray, just because I find like it just adds like a little bit of that warmer tone to my painting. I think sometimes my issue with some of this painting is I'm not brave enough. Keep telling myself, be brave, just go in with the brush strokes and who cares what happens. And then I kind of pull back. So it feels like, oh, it's maybe too much. So I'm moving to a square brush because I think I'm just getting a little too fussy about stuff. So we're just going to try to go in and be a little bit more targeted. I think that's better though. I think I'm moving in the right direction. I think I have a little bit more dynamic range than I did. I still feel like this is a painting that could have done with having a good reference photo to start with, instead of just coming up with random shapes from my head. So I could keep going with these paintings for hours. That's sometimes the hard thing, is knowing when to stop. But I did want to try to play around with the values and try to get more of the values like you would see on this card. And that's really important. It's harder to do because it takes a little more bravery. It's easy to stick with those midtones. Going for that really strong black, that really bright white can feel a little bit intimidating. So it's something that I continue to work on, where I tell myself, be brave before I start on a painting. So I hope you've enjoyed this project and how far we can take pastes in our creative projects. I know I often use them in my stencils, but there's so many other ways you can use them. So I hope this has opened your eyes to just how many different ways you can mix color and do some really interesting things with your pastes. And if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like it, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on any future videos. And anytime that you like a video, that just shares that video with more people, and that really helps small channels like mine. So just thank you so much for your support. And if you have any questions about what I've shared today, just please leave a comment below. I would love to hear what you have to say about what I've shared today and any questions that you might have. And you might have noticed I only talked about paste today and not gels. Gels have some other complicated things about them that make them interesting to use in the art journal and in Canvas projects, but require a few more steps or understanding of colors to be able to get really good results with them. And I'd love to share that in a separate video. If that's a video you'd be interested in, please leave a comment below and I'd love to share that information with you. And if you're looking for another video about pastes, click here. This is one that I did about different textures, how to put them on panels, and just went over some of the different textures that I like to use in my creative projects. So I'll see you in the next video.